Lecture 131, July 14, 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, it may have amazed some of you that I keep harping on about this difference between method for its own sake, or as a primarily methodologically oriented way of thinking about society, and an approach that corrects the method based on reflection about the matter. And perhaps some of you assumed that this was some form of obsession, and that I was assigning an exaggerated significance to a more or less particular aspect. Perhaps I can say that the point on which I was so fixated, if I am not mistaken, is truly at the heart of the entire current socio-theoretical controversy. This issue, with the so-called flawless, foolproof method on the one hand, where the concept of science becomes an end in itself, and on the other hand the attempt to grasp the matter even if that matter, because it is internally contradictory, eludes any contradiction-free logic and any total context of foundation. That is essentially what the whole dispute is about between positivist thinking, in the broadest sense, in social science, on the one hand, and on the other hand those sociological positions which God knows you will find represented here in Frankfurt by our sociologists and philosophers. So this is really the point on which the interests of social science diverge today. I would certainly say that today, as was equally true 50 years ago, the interest in method or methodology has become so dangerously predominant that a certain immediacy of approach towards a matter, without all the epistemological, let alone empirically experimental undertakings, is more productive than the so-called methodological neatness. Hegel already knew this. I believe I pointed this out to you, when, in the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit, he criticized an epistemology that is isolated, autonomous and independent of any method as formalism, even in its highest form, namely the Kantian form, confronting it with the saying that one becomes a blacksmith by working in a smithy too. If I can say one thing to you today in relation to your training in the social sciences, I would almost hazard the paradox that it is the task, not only the task of professors, but also your own task in particular, if you are to work critically on yourselves, as they say, to acquire naivete. One would think that the opposite is the case, that one arrives at university with naivete, shall we say, that is, with a wealth of attitudes, ideas, notions, prejudices too, and all manner of things, and that this naivete is then disciplined by reflection on the correct way of gaining knowledge, namely through the intentio obliqua, the self-referentiality of thinking. In reality, it is the other way around, what I call scientific fetishism, that is, the predominance of a method that has been declared valuable in its own right and cultivated accordingly, is so immense that naivete, in the sense I mean here, is actually what people find most difficult. And that this is what they actually need to acquire first. And in fact I keep experiencing, for example in examinations or among those students, sadly there are too few from your circles, whose individual development I can follow a little more closely, that they essentially find it hardest, that this is where they need the most encouragement to have spontaneous ideas, to devote themselves to the matter itself without regulations and embrace a primary observation. Instead, from the outset, as if under a spell, the spell of science as organized in the university, they forbid themselves to have any unregulated idea, and especially any direct view of the matter. And I would say that this manifests in the fact that it is far harder, as becomes clear if one carries out a so-called content analysis 3 in a seminar, that is, a sociological analysis of some printed, let us say propagandistic material, that the students generally find it much harder to produce all manner of ideas and thoughts on what is behind it, what it means, than to set up the methodology for an investigation or assess material in a methodological statistical way, or that sort of thing. It is a most peculiar mechanism of delusion, and I would genuinely ask you very practically, as a follow-up to this highly theoretical lecture, to check your own behavior, to reflect on yourselves, on this curious hysteron-proteron, whereby the actual material that was meant to be organized is later and weaker than the forms of intellectual organization that take its place. Naturally, the blame for this lies with that almost unspoken ban which is part of the entire university system and, as I wish to emphasize, is by no means limited to the natural sciences, the exact sciences, where a primacy of method, especially in pure mathematics, but also asserts itself in the primacy of certain philological viewpoints in the humanities and prevents people from developing a primary connection to the matter itself, from penetrating into the actual organization of a work of art. So it prevents us from, shall we say, examining the conditions of its production or the conditions under which it existed historically, or all sorts of things that initially seem external to the matter itself. It is really a little like the story, which is entirely true, about my friend Horkheimer, who once found himself in the situation of owning a dog that adamantly refused to bark, and then taught it how to bark. We should really be teaching you to bark instead of, as is customary in the training of dogs, and I hope none of you will be offended by this animal analogy. I would be happy to identify with a dog, more than with most people. Yes, I cannot help it. I did not actually force it on you, ladies and gentlemen, I was only speaking of myself, so I would urgently advise you to examine yourselves on this point, for I have attempted to characterize the sterility we can observe today in the whole of intellectual life, and which almost all of you have probably noticed in some way and must labor under, with reference to the hysteron-proteron, at least in the field that can be termed science. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is another highly peculiar, how should I put it? Another inversion of the facts initially given, because one would think that a concentration on method would lead to a constant sharpening and intensification of awareness towards undisciplined thinking, that the mental capacity, by becoming specialized, by training as an independent skill, grows stronger in a similar way to particular muscles. Hugo von Hofmannsthal said on some occasion that cleverness is an especially dangerous form of stupidity, for meaning cleverness for its own sake, where thought processes are automatized, in a sense, running by themselves without being interrupted. These thought processes thus take on something mechanical, with the ultimate result that the connection to the matter itself, which is devalued by the primacy of the method, is increasingly truly lost. So it is already the case that concentration on more and more polished and more cunning methods, if I might put it like that, leads to the point where a kind of stultifying process sets in. If you analyze certain empirical studies of the kind one finds in the American Journal of Sociology, you will be struck by the incredibly polished nature of the methodological apparatus, which draws on the most sophisticated mathematical tools, combined with the utter poverty and irrelevance of the resulting findings. That is, this concentration on the method truly leads to an inability to understand the matter itself, and this, ladies and gentlemen, even becomes an ideology in the dominant positivist mindset, that proud ideology which, as soon as it encounters an intellectual construct guided primarily by the matter itself, declares, with a more or less heavy shrug of the shoulders, well, I don't understand that. But this non-understanding simultaneously becomes the index very for what lies behind this. If one analyses this I don't understand, it is the belief that, if I, with the whole phalanx of science on my side, as it were, don't understand something, then it's obvious that it can't be anything at all, so that takes care of that. I am using this opportunity to make you suspicious, to turn you against any statement in which a person behaves especially proudly, for that is always a highly questionable affair. I will only touch on this point now and say instead that a true method, and I told you last time that I am anything but a despiser of method, must constantly reflect upon itself, based on its relationship to the matter it is dealing with. Let me return to Max Weber for a moment, as I have promised you on repeated occasions that we would take a cursory glance at some of his basic positions, at least those of the methodologist Max Weber. There is a passage by Weber in which he turns somewhat spitefully on both the mere material collector and material collecting, and, with a neologism, also against spirit collecting. 5. That spirit is here equated with a mere accumulation of material through linguistic education is itself an expression of a certain rancor to which Weber, incidentally, was forced more by his own position than by spiritual qualities, for a lack of spirit, a lack of primary observation of the matter, is really not something of which one could ever accuse Max Weber. He just overlooked one thing, namely that there is a precise correlation between material collecting on the one hand and the cult of methodology on the other. This means that, wherever method becomes an end in itself and something more or less formal, as a kind of corrective or to assuage its guilty conscience, it has a tendency to accumulate the greatest possible amount of material and then attempt to place this back inside its famous casing. What makes the term spirit collecting so extremely unjust is that spirit is precisely that behavior of the consciousness, of the scientific and philosophical consciousness, which refuses to bow to the separation of instrumental, merely tool-like reason on the one hand and qualityless, collectible and classifiable materials on the other, and seeks to establish a specific relationship between the two. As it happens, this exact aspect of instrumentalizing reason, that is, of separating the method from the matter and from dialectic too, is very much a social phenomenon, deeply interwoven with the bourgeois spirit, which after all began, accompanied by a number of basic laws that have been modified but remain binding, with a discourse on method. So really, if one wishes to use the social categories reflected in this, the precedence of the method over the matter is, from a social point of view, quite simply the basic principle of bourgeois society itself, namely an abstraction from the specific utility values, the specific qualities that things develop in themselves and through interaction with humans, in favor of their general form of equivalence, their value, which is then abstracted. And just as everything in our society is, in reality, judged according to this abstract principle of value that is divorced from the matter itself, so too, in science and philosophy, this abstract aspect, which is simply split off from the specifically qualitative character of things, is turned into a quality in itself. It seems to be a universal law of bourgeois society as such, and connected to the fact that bourgeois society is rational, but only partially rational, that is, only in the pursuit of limited individual interests, and not rationally transparent as a whole, that there develops something like a predominance of the means over the ends. And this general predominance of the means over the ends then became what one can observe today as a fetishism, if not a religion of science. What is more, these things extend extremely deeply into anthropological behaviors, the relationship countless people have with technology, for example, where they are immediately more interested in how some machine works, and are drawn to anything technological, without the actual function of the technology playing a substantial part any longer. Probably an infantile mode of behavior, incidentally, that of the child, which cannot rest until the clock has been opened up and it can see how the little cogs work inside it, this essentially infantile and repressed behavior, which replaces the ends with the means because people are ultimately denied these ends in the world in which we live, is probably the innermost dialectical anthropological reason for this fetishism I have attempted to describe to you. But what makes this question I am discussing so serious, I believe, is the fact that this instrumental mindset, this united front of material accumulation and methodology, has led to something like a general defamation of spirit in science as such, and I think it is important for you, in your academic training, to be aware of this education sociological or knowledge sociological fact of the defamation of spirit. Certainly, spirit is recognized where it is covered by great names and bears great prestige. Hölderlin and Goethe had spirit, so there's nothing one can do about that, but if one simply behaved towards them like someone who knows like by like, one would immediately be accused of being unscientific. And they would try to put one in one's place, not by the rules of the individual but, naturally, by those of strict, ascetic science devoted purely to the matter itself, even if this devotion to the matter itself is completely opposed to that matter, namely to spirit. If I tell you that once, in an academic committee, when I pointed out the lack of quality in an especially vacuous piece of work, I was told, well, the quality lies in the work itself, that is, in the fact that this text contains so much material, and not in what insights are to be gained from this material. Then you will understand that, when I point these things out to you, I am not speaking as a blind man speaks of colors. But I do at least want to say, and I think this is necessary because one very easily arrives, due to the spirit's strategic situation in which one is operating, at formulations that are strictly speaking one-sided and undialectical, which is why I want to emphasize this especially strongly. Do not, for heaven's sake, confuse the fact that the concept of spirit, which I have now tried to contrast with the concept of method, meaning a purely formal cleverness, as well as with a blind material. Do not think that I am confusing this concept of spirit with an idling of the thought mechanism within itself, which then satisfies itself via itself, as it were. I tried earlier to show you, at least briefly, that spirit is what attempts to overcome the separation of the thought as a means and the matter as the material to be worked on by this means, through a form of constant self-examination with reference to the material, and I would like to go a step further. Nothing is more beneficial to spirit than for it to surrender to the material as a blind, intentionless material, not one that is already prepared, classified and mutilated to suit what is cultural and strong. Spirit is realized in the material, not in the mere contemplation it finds within itself. Benjamin once told me, I was still very young at the time, how much stupidity is required to think a decent thought. And I later learned that there was a very substantial element of truth in that, because one surrenders to the material without always being able to escape one's experience of it by subsuming it under existing, fully formed categories. And when I spoke earlier of naivete, I did not simply mean that one comes up with an idea about the material because one always comes up with something, but that one really surrenders to it exactly as one finds it. And that one can wait for this material itself, precisely in those respects in which it does not already fit into categories, in which it is not preformed, that this is precisely where it offers what actually matters for gaining insight. If that is not the case, if one has lost the ability to surrender blindly and unguardedly to the material, this is no better than, on the other hand, embracing an empty and abstract methodology, and I would argue that the two behaviors are in fact virtually the same. You may now ask the reason for the scientific fetishism I have described to you, for it is scarcely enough simply to describe such things. If one truly wants to get beyond them, one must also gain a sense of what has caused them. One can only overcome them by understanding them in their own processes. You must understand, ladies and gentlemen, and I am the last person who would keep this from you or minimize it, that the development whose consequences, in the sense of deformation, I have presented to you essentially has the entire force of the development of modern society behind it. And I must therefore tell you that the deliberations I have undertaken with you, assuming you follow them through, really lead you into direct opposition to the entire complex of what one generally calls traditional thought or traditional theory. If some of the things I have expounded to you strike you as plausible, do not let this plausibility fool you. For the solid, very solid majority stands against what you have heard here, and engaging with these ideas can only possibly be fruitful for you if you are also fully aware, from the outset, of their powerlessness in the reality we inhabit and the almost desperate isolation that awaits you, if you pursue such ideas seriously. So one can first of all say that, on the objective side, this scientific fetishism is a result of the incredible triumphs. It is no coincidence if one thinks of a word like triumph in this context, that science has genuinely achieved in its dealings with nature. What I have presented to you here as something very problematic in philosophy and the general area of the social sciences, and which I feel has proved so powerless in sociology itself to this day and beyond, has been immensely successful in its model, namely the model of the mathematical physical natural sciences, and has brought about an upswing in all the forces of technical productivity that enabled the expansion and dynamics of recent history in the first place. And naturally people can easily point to this whenever one advances the objections that I have laid out for you. From the outset, then, we are in the situation of the tiny little David against the gigantic Goliath. Then there is something else, something I might call the metaphysical aspect. I think that today we can barely imagine how devastating was the loss of the cosmos noetikos, the closed Christian world of the Middle Ages. How horrific it must have been for people to learn that the world was not a vault extending over them as something objectively meaningful, that it did not offer them the certain prospect of salvation and a kind of restitution for all the terrible things facing them in life. And it was science that showed the power to topple the old theological cosmos, and which contains that incredible, almost irresistible stringency of pure method, which replaced that same cosmos. And it took a long time to develop and really reached fruition only with thinkers such as Nietzsche and Henry Bergson to teach people that scientific thinking cannot act as a substitute for this, as people once believed. On the other hand, there are unquestionably also subjective reasons for the specific scientific fetishism of today, by which I mean reasons that also point back to the social element, namely the ego weakness of individual people. It is surely true, and this explains why this fetishism is passed on, why people keep falling prey to it if they do not think about it themselves, that, if there is nothing else to a thing, and, I would almost say, to a person, then it is, or that person is, at least science, with a recognized place within this overall context of scientific thinking and non-thinking, and will thus vicariously gain a form of respect and legitimacy, both in their own eyes and in those of others, that they would not otherwise receive. So, if one considers that today this scientific fetishism, which is generally associated with the 19th century and which people once believed, around the time of Max Scheler, had been overcome or was passé, is once again stirring with such incredible force, a form of spiritual reflection constituting an ever stronger, I am slipping into paradoxes, ever greater ego weakness among individuals, whose real powerlessness in society makes it increasingly hard for them to believe, intellectually too, that they can get by on their own, under their own steam, autonomously. This is based on the excessive need for security that people have in general. One feels safe with this concept of science in the same way an employee of a megacorporation feels safe from the hardships of natural disasters, society and the economy, failing to see that the elimination of mental risks also corresponds to the socio-economic situation in a certain way, where the earlier so-called business hazard is largely eliminated, or at least seemingly eliminated. So one has the feeling that nothing can happen to one. But in matters of spirit, and any matter of insight that is not mere nonsense, it is simply the case that there is no truth without risk, the risk of untruth, just as in moral philosophy, and one could scarcely level this criticism at Kant's moral philosophy. There is no good in the world that has not been wrested from the risk of evil. Good that can be taken for granted and follows automatically, as it were, is something we have every reason to view with great suspicion. It is quite simply a withering of the aspect of play, of genuine experimentation in thought, which is only one aspect, but destroys truth itself if it is entirely absent. Today the situation in intellectual matters is the same as what we are confronted with everywhere in social and political reality, namely that what causes people the most difficulty is the very thing which one would initially think is the primary concern, the one their entire needs revolve around: freedom. A problem, incidentally, that has received much attention from the most diverse authors and perspectives. I will name only the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, who has examined this problem, and here my national economist colleague Veit, who, quite independently of Fromm, also devoted a book to this problem of the fear of freedom. 6. But I think it has not quite been grasped how far this problem also extends into the realm of spirit, and above all the theory of society. And, because this self-reflection has not occurred, no one has set about fundamentally correcting these things as would be necessary for a theory of society. I would say that a thinking which is essentially and primarily method-oriented is actually, I am exaggerating again, an employee mentality, that the people who think like that are already behaving like employees, even if they are not in terms of their own social position. It is a thinking where one no longer really has the confidence to think. This reflects, and that is where this is so devilishly serious, and I say that without the slightest irony, for I take these things extremely hard, that people have so little cause to be confident in reality, and it is very hard to demand that people's spirit should show confidence, when, in their actual existence, this confidence is almost inevitably followed by disappointment and cannot be realized at all. So the reason for this need for security, and thus for scientific fetishism, is the insecurity of the individual subjects, the uncertainty of us all, insofar as we rightly view ourselves as social objects. To carry out the reflection we have just performed, and I am now repeating something I had already told you elsewhere, requires a theory of society that, as I have at least tried to outline, deduces the need for security, whereas the need for security rejects theory in an emphatic sense. The situation of the employees of science is, in reality, the situation of people who no longer decide their own fate and despair at deciding it. But there is, even for theory, a form that at least seems to promise this security, and that is the form of science as a system. On the other hand, it is precisely this system character and the closure and security of the system that have brought it into such conflict with the form of reality. I have said a number of things about this conflict already. I think my next task will be to show you what the word system actually means, and why theory, in its current state, can on no account be a system anymore, but now from the other perspective, which I have not yet touched on, namely that the idea of a system which is entirely independent of society as a philosophical idea is no longer tenable and that it is historically obsolete. And that is where I shall begin in the next session. Notes of Lecture 141.